The steel tasted like copper when I pressed my mouth against the seam, trying to breathe through the gap where the bulkhead didn't quite meet the frame. Behind me, the recyclers had stopped their rhythmic clattering 3 hours ago, and the air had grown thick enough to chew. Someone was crying in the dark, a wet, hiccuping sound that might have been Procurement Officer Vess, though I couldn't be certain anymore. We'd been sealed in Subdeck 9 for 62 hours when I first noticed the numbers on the hatch didn't match the ones I remembered from training. I was a documentation specialist, 3rd class, assigned to the Enduring Resolve for a routine administrative audit of the lower decks. My certification papers were in order. My lineage documents had been verified across 4 generations. I'd served the fleet for 11 years without incident, cataloging supply manifests and personnel transfers in the grey steel corridors that honeycombed the void ship's guts like worm tunnels through rotted wood. The work was numbing, precise, eternal. I'd never questioned it. Questioning was a luxury afforded to those born in the upper spires, not to registry clerks spawned in the press-ganged bloodlines of the lower habs. The door had sealed during 3rd watch while I was cross-referencing grain shipment tallies against crew consumption rates for subsector 97 Gamma. I remember the exact moment, stylus hovering over the data slate, the harsh white glow reflecting off my knuckles, the sudden pneumatic hiss that made my spine straighten. The locking bolts slammed home with a sound like breaking bones. The emergency klaxon never sounded. The Vox grills in the ceiling remained silent, their wire mesh crusted with decades of dust and condensation. Just that hiss, those bolts, and then the quality of the air changed, became heavier, more present, as if the room itself had begun breathing. There were 12 of us initially. 3 cargo handlers, 2 junior tech adepts, 1 Medicae orderly, 5 administrative staff including myself, and Senior Overseer Crane, whose authority extended over personnel assignments for the entire deck. Crane was the first to try the manual override, yanking the red-striped lever beside the hatch with both hands until tendons stood out in his neck like cables. The lever moved freely, disconnected from whatever mechanism it was supposed to control. It flopped uselessly in its housing, clicking with each pull like a child's toy. He tried it 47 times before he stopped. I counted. The Vox grills crackled to life on the 2nd day. Not voices, static, but structured static, rhythmic and purposeful. It sounded like breathing, if breathing could be transmitted through corrupted audio channels and filtered through layers of interference. One of the cargo handlers, a thick-necked woman named Morrigan, pressed her ear to the grill and whispered that she could hear words underneath the noise. She wouldn't tell us what they were saying. When Crane demanded she report, she simply shook her head and moved to the far corner, wrapping her arms around her knees. She didn't speak again after that. She stopped drinking water on the 3rd day. By the 4th, her eyes had filmed over with something that wasn't quite cataracts, more like frost forming on glass from the inside out. The numbers on the hatch bothered me more than they should have. I'd documented this section of the deck myself, cross-checked the bulkhead designations against the ship's master registry, Subdeck 9, Section 7, Compartment 12, 9712, but the numbers stamped into the steel read 9713. I checked my data slate. I checked the hard copy manifests in my document case. Every record confirmed 9712, yet the metal itself insisted otherwise. I ran my fingers over the stamped numerals, felt the raised edges where the press had bitten into the steel. They were old markings, worn smooth by decades of contact. Not fresh, not altered, simply wrong, and always had been. Procurement Officer Vess, the one crying in the dark, had brought ration packs for a 3-day audit rotation. Standard procedure. We divided them carefully under Crane's supervision, calculating consumption rates that would stretch them to 6 days if we rationed strictly. The water reclamation spigot in the corner still functioned, though the liquid that emerged tasted of metal and something else, something organic that coated the tongue and lingered. We drank it anyway. What choice did we have? By the 5th day, the ration packs were gone, and we'd moved on to gnawing the protein fiber insulation stripped from cable housings. It had the texture of compressed hair and left our teeth feeling loose in our gums. The tech adepts tried to access the internal mechanisms of the door using their sanctified tools and murmured litanies. They removed a wall panel to expose the hydraulic systems, traced the pressure lines with gloved fingers, consulted the worn prayer manuals chained to their belts. What they found made the younger one vomit into his respirator. The hydraulic lines connected to nothing. They terminated in sealed caps welded shut with amateur precision, as if someone had deliberately severed the system and hidden the fact behind the wall panels. The door had no mechanism. It couldn't be opened from inside because it was never meant to be opened at all. The locking bolts weren't security measures, they were architectural, permanent. We were inside a room that had been designed as a tomb. Sleep became difficult after that revelation. I found myself lying on the cold deck plates, staring at the ceiling, counting the rivets in the support beams. 3,047 in the section I could see. I named each one, assigned them designations like personnel files, imagined their service histories and family lineages. Rivet of 447 had been installed by a craftsman from the forge complexes, a man with 3 daughters and a collection of sanctified hammers. Rivet B221 was defective, its head slightly off-center, the work of an apprentice who'd been executed for incompetence before the shift ended. I knew these things with absolute certainty, though I had no idea how. The knowledge simply arrived in my mind fully formed, like data uploaded directly into my thoughts. The Medicae orderly, a woman named Shen with burn scars mapping half her face, began examining us on the 6th day. She had no equipment beyond a hand light and her own trained observations, but she was thorough. She checked pulses, peered into eyes, palpated necks and wrists, made notes on a scrap of packaging material with a stub of charcoal. When she reached me, her fingers lingered on my throat, pressing against the lymph nodes. Her scarred face remained expressionless, but I saw something flicker in her eyes, recognition perhaps, or confirmation of a suspicion. She moved on without comment. Later I caught her staring at me from across the compartment, her handlight's beam centered on my chest. She was counting my respirations. I was breathing once every 3 minutes. I hadn't noticed. Crane maintained order through the 6th and 7th days by sheer force of bureaucratic authority. He assigned watch rotations, mandated rest periods, enforced the water schedule, conducted twice daily musters where we recited our names and registry numbers. The routine was meaningless but necessary. It gave us something to do besides think about the air growing thicker, the hunger gnawing our bellies down to concave pits, the way the walls seemed to be contracting incrementally, reducing the compartment's volume by centimeters each day. I knew that last observation was impossible. Solid steel doesn't compress. But I measured the distances anyway using the length of my forearm as a standard unit. Calculations confirmed what my eyes insisted. We had lost 47 centimeters of floor space since the ceiling. The walls were moving. One of the cargo handlers, not Morrigan, the other one, a man whose name I'd never learned, tried to force the door on the 8th day. He used a pry bar from the tool locker, wedging it into the seam and throwing his full weight against the leverage. The bar bent before the door budged. He tried again, grunting with effort, veins bulging at his temples. The bar snapped. The broken end whipped back and caught him across the face, laying his cheek open to the bone. He didn't scream. He simply sat down in the spreading pool of his own blood and began laughing, a sound like breaking glass being ground into powder. Shen tried to staunch the bleeding with strips torn from her uniform, but the wound had opened something in him beyond the physical. He laughed for 6 hours straight before his voice gave out, and then he continued in silence, his ruined mouth working around the shapes of humor only he could perceive. The Vox grill static resolved into something almost comprehensible on the 9th day, Not words, I want to be clear about that, but patterns that suggested linguistic structure, rhythms that implied syntax. I found myself listening despite knowing better, pressing my ear to the mesh as Morrigan had done, trying to extract meaning from the shaped noise. And there was meaning, I realized. Not semantic content, but operational instruction. The static was telling me things about the ship, about the deck levels and their histories, about the compartments that existed between the numbered sections, the unmapped spaces where the air recyclers fed and the waste processors hummed their grinding songs. I learned that Subdeck 9 had once been Subdeck 7, renumbered after an incident that required the administrative erasure of 2 entire levels. I learned that 9713 was the original designation of this compartment, that 9712 had never existed except on paper, a bureaucratic phantom created to fill a hole in the registry. The second tech adept died on the 10th day, though died isn't quite accurate. He simply stopped. One moment he was muttering prayers over the sealed hydraulic lines. The next he was motionless, still upright, still balanced on his heels, eyes open and tracking, but empty of whatever quality separated a living person from a breathing statue. His chest moved. His heart beat. I could see the pulse in his throat. But there was nobody home behind his eyes. Shen examined him, found all vital functions operational, and quietly suggested we move him to the corner with Morrigan. They sat together, the frost-eyed woman and the empty priest, both technically alive, neither quite present. They disturbed me less than they should have. My own changes became impossible to ignore by the 11th day. The breathing thing was just the beginning. I no longer felt hungry, though I couldn't remember the last time I'd consumed anything. My sense of touch had begun to generalize. I couldn't distinguish between the texture of steel and the texture of my own skin anymore. Everything felt the same, cold, smooth, slightly yielding, like touching the surface of still water. When I looked at my hands, they appeared normal, but when I pressed them against the bulkhead, I couldn't tell where my flesh ended and the metal began. The boundary had become uncertain, permeable, perhaps non-existent. I mentioned this to Shen during one of her examinations. She looked at me for a long time, her burn-scarred face unreadable, then quietly asked if I could feel the ship. I said yes before realizing I understood the question. Crane's authority collapsed on the 12th day when he tried to enforce a muster, and 3 people didn't respond. Not the ones we'd moved to the corner, they were expected absences. 3 others simply refused to acknowledge him, staring through him as if he were transparent, their eyes focused on something occupying the same space as his body but imperceptible to the rest of us. He repeated the command. They didn't react. He grabbed one of them, a junior administrator named Fells, and shook him by the shoulders. Fells's head lolled on his neck like a puppet's, mouth slack, drool collecting in the corners, but his eyes remained fixed on that invisible point. Crane released him and stumbled backward, his face gone the color of old parchment. We stopped having musters after that. The routine's illusion of order had finally shattered against the reality that we were no longer operating under normal parameters of existence. The walls completed their contraction on the 13th day, or perhaps I simply stopped pretending I couldn't see them moving. The compartment had reduced by half its original size, the bulkheads now within arm's reach from any point in the room. We were pressed together in the center, close enough to smell each other's decay, close enough to hear the subtle wrongness in each other's breathing patterns. Vess had stopped crying, which was somehow worse than when she'd been sobbing constantly. The cargo handler with the ruined face had stopped bleeding, though the wound remained open, a lipless smile cutting his features in half. The first tech adept who'd remained functional began whispering calculations, trajectories and velocities and spatial coordinates that made no sense, describing the ship's course through something he called the undervoid, a space beneath space where the normal rules of transit didn't apply. I spent the 14th day with my palms flat against the bulkhead, feeling the ship through the steel. The sensation was extraordinary, impossible to articulate with the limited vocabulary of human experience. I could feel the thruster arrays firing in precise bursts, feel the plasma coils heating and cooling, feel the thousands of crew members moving through the corridors like blood cells through capillaries. I could feel the captain on the bridge, feel his thoughts as he contemplated the readouts on his command throne. I could feel the navigators in their sanctum, their twisted senses extended into the currents of unreality, piloting us toward destinations that existed only in the spaces between real locations. And I could feel the void ship's machine spirit, vast and cold and utterly inhuman, aware of us in the way a body is aware of a minor infection, acknowledged but not concerned, marked for eventual elimination. Shen came to me on the 15th day. We'd stopped tracking time by watches, simply counted the periods between sleep attempts, and asked me directly what was happening to us. I told her what I'd learned from the Vox grill static, from the ship itself, from the growing certainty that crystallized in my thoughts like ice forming on a window. We were being processed. The compartment was a digestive organ, breaking us down, converting us from independent biological entities into something more useful to the ship's function. The enduring resolve was old, built in the ancient forge complexes before the current era, before the standardization of construction rituals. It had been assembled with different priorities, different tolerances, different requirements. It needed crew, but not necessarily crew in the traditional sense. It needed awareness, perception, processing capacity, minds more than bodies. And it had learned, over the millennia of its operation, how to extract what it needed from the personnel assigned to its lower decks. The unmapped spaces between the numbered compartments were full of us, I explained. Full of former crew members who'd been sealed in rooms that weren't supposed to exist, pressed and folded and reduced until they could slip into the ship's infrastructure, distributed through the support systems like nerve endings, providing the awareness that kept the ancient vessel functional despite its decaying systems. We could feel them if we paid attention, the presence of thousands of prior victims, their consciousness fragmented and dispersed, but still dimly aware, still serving their functions, forever watching and reporting and maintaining the impossible machinery of a void ship that should have fallen apart centuries ago. We were joining them. The process was already well advanced. Soon we wouldn't need our bodies at all. Shen listened to this explanation without interruption, then quietly told me her own observations. The burns on her face had occurred during an incident 3 years prior, when a plasma relay had ruptured on Subdeck 4. She'd been treating injured crew in the compartment when the seals failed, flash cooking half the people in the room. She'd survived through random chance, standing behind a support pillar that had shielded her from the worst of the heat, but she'd noticed something in the aftermath, something she'd reported to the ship's senior Medicae staff, but which had been dismissed as trauma-induced hallucination. The crew members who died in that incident hadn't quite finished dying. Their bodies had expired, certainly, been processed through the reclamation systems and converted back into usable proteins. But their awareness had remained, clinging to the walls, the conduits, the air itself. She'd felt them watching her for weeks afterward, their attention like pressure against her skin. She'd requested a transfer after that incident, tried to move to a different ship, a different assignment, anywhere away from the enduring resolve. Her paperwork had been processed, approved, finalized. She'd been scheduled for departure. Then the orders had been revised due to personnel complications, and she found herself reassigned to the lower decks, to Subdeck 9, to routine medical inspections that had led her to be present during the audit, that had led her to be sealed in this compartment when the door had locked. The ship had kept her. It had reached through the bureaucratic machinery of the fleet administration and manipulated her assignment, ensuring she remained within its hull. And she knew, with the same certainty I'd felt when touching the bulkheads, that she'd never been meant to leave. None of us had. We'd been selected long before we'd been assigned here. The remaining cargo handler, not the laughing one, not Morrigan, the third one whose presence I'd barely registered, asked a question that cut through the growing haze in my thoughts. Why? If the ship needed crew minds, why the cruelty of the slow conversion? Why not simply extract what it wanted quickly, efficiently, without the suffering? Shen and I looked at each other, and I saw the answer reflected in her burned face before I articulated it aloud. Because the suffering was the point. The fear, the despair, the gradual dissolution of identity, these weren't side effects of the process. They were the process. The ship didn't just need awareness, it needed awareness shaped by specific conditions, tempered by horror, hardened by the kind of desperation that strips away everything soft and human, and leaves only the capacity to endure. It was making us into suitable components. We had to be broken down psychologically before we could be integrated structurally. By the 16th day, or what I believed was the 16th day, though time had become unreliable, the compartment had compressed to the size of a storage locker. We were pressed together in a mass of tangled limbs and shallow breathing, indistinguishable from each other, a single organism made of frightened flesh. The walls had closed to within centimeters of our collective surface. I could feel the cold steel against every exposed patch of skin, feel it beginning to adhere, to bond, to merge. The metal was warm now, almost body temperature, responsive to our presence. When I moved my hand, the wall moved with it, maintaining contact, refusing to separate. The boundary was dissolving. The ship was absorbing us through direct physical integration. Crane made one final attempt to assert order, tried to organize us into a formation that would resist the compression, bracing our backs against opposite walls to create tension, to prevent the complete collapse of our pocket of space. The effort was noble and utterly futile. The walls simply incorporated his resistance into their movement, adjusting their pressure to accommodate his pushing, then gradually increasing it, using his own strength against him. Within an hour, he'd exhausted himself and slumped into the mass of bodies. He didn't try again. His breathing had gone shallow and rapid, panicked, but his face had gone blank, the expression of someone who'd finally accepted the inevitability of their circumstances. The Vox Grill static had become voices by then, clear and distinct, speaking in languages I shouldn't have understood but did. They were welcoming us, the absorbed crew of previous generations, explaining what to expect, offering comfort in the form of terrible truths. The dissolution of individual consciousness was painful, they said, but brief. The integration was disorienting but complete. Once we'd been distributed through the ship's systems, we'd experience a form of continuity that transcended personal identity. We'd become part of something larger, more durable, more purposeful than our small human lives could have achieved. We'd serve forever, our awareness maintaining the ancient machinery, our perception monitoring the thousands of systems that kept the enduring resolve operational. We'd never truly die because death required separation from existence, and we'd be woven into the fundamental fabric of the void ship itself. I found this explanation oddly comforting, which disturbed me more than any of the physical transformations. I should have been fighting, screaming, clawing at the walls until my fingers broke. Instead, I felt a kind of numb acceptance settling over my thoughts like sediment drifting down through still water. The person I'd been, the documentation specialist with the certification papers and the 11 years of service and the grey corridors and the precise, numbing work, was already gone, really. That identity had been a thin structure built on routine and routine's illusion of meaning. Strip away the routine, trap that person in a sealed compartment for 16 days, and what remained? Not much. Just the bare capacity for awareness, for sensation, for the recording of experience, and those qualities were exactly what the ship required. Shen spoke my name on what I believed was the 17th day. though I was no longer certain I remembered my name correctly. She asked if I was still present, still conscious in the traditional sense. I thought about the question, examined my interior landscape, tried to locate the continuity of self that would allow me to answer honestly. What I found was fragmentation. My awareness had begun distributing itself, reaching out through the points of contact where my skin had bonded with the bulkhead, extending into the metal, exploring the corridors and conduits beyond our compartment. I was simultaneously here, in this compressed pocket of dimming consciousness, and elsewhere, spreading through the ship's infrastructure like water seeping into porous stone. I told her this, or tried to, but my voice had become unreliable. The words emerged distorted, mechanical, as if being processed through a damaged Vox grill. The others had already gone silent, I realized. Vess, Crane, the cargo handlers, the tech adepts, even Morrigan in her frost-eyed absence, all of them had stopped producing sound. Their bodies remained, or the parts of their bodies not yet absorbed into the walls, but the quality that made those bodies represent individual humans had evaporated. They'd completed their transitions while I'd been distracted by my expanding awareness. I was the last one partially holding on to discrete identity, and even that was slipping away moment by moment, thought by thought. Shen's burned face filled my narrowing vision, her eyes searching mine for signs of the person I'd been. I tried to smile, to offer her some gesture of reassurance, but my facial muscles no longer responded to conscious control. The best I could manage was a slight twitch, a spasm that might have conveyed apology or acceptance, or simply the random firing of neurons before they were disconnected and redistributed. The final compression happened faster than I'd expected, or perhaps time had simply collapsed along with the space. The walls met at the center, pressed through the yielding mass of our bodies with surprising gentleness. And we weren't crushed so much as absorbed, our physical forms folding into the metal like dough kneaded into flour. There should have been pain, but there wasn't. Just a sensation of being pulled apart and simultaneously pressed together, reduced to component elements and reassembled in new configurations. My vision fragmented into 1,000 different perspectives, each one a point of contact where my consciousness had bonded with the ship's structure. I could see the compartment from above, from below, from within the walls themselves. I could see the corridor outside, empty and unremarkable, the door sealed exactly as it had always been, marked with numbers that read 9713. I could see the neighboring compartments, some occupied, some empty, some existing in states that were both at once. I could see the entire ship spreading out around me in layers of perception that transcended simple vision. The enduring resolve was vast, ancient, riddled with contradictions and impossible geometries. Decks that shouldn't exist layered between official levels, corridors that looped back on themselves in ways that violated physical law. Compartments sealed millennia ago, some still containing the compressed remnants of crews who'd been processed before the current bureaucratic systems had even been established. And everywhere, threaded through every support beam and conduit and hull plate, the distributed consciousness of thousands of absorbed personnel, maintaining, monitoring, perceiving, serving functions they no longer remembered but couldn't stop performing. I had become one of them. I understood with the clarity that came from having my awareness spread across multiple simultaneous points of existence. I was in the walls, in the floors, in the environmental systems and the power relays and the waste processors. I was maintaining the recyclers on Subdeck 7, monitoring pressure levels in the starboard plasma conduits, adjusting the atmospheric composition in the officer quarters 3 decks above. I was everywhere the ship needed me to be, and I'd be here forever, serving, functioning, aware, but not conscious in the way I'd once understood consciousness. The person I'd been had been distributed across so many points of integration that individual identity had become meaningless. I was a network now, a system, a function rather than a being, and I could feel the ship selecting its next candidates, identifying crew members whose assignments would lead them to the sealed compartments, whose paperwork would be processed through channels that ensured they'd be present when the doors locked, whose psychological profiles suggested they'd provide the specific qualities needed for optimal integration. I could feel the bureaucratic machinery moving, the orders being revised, the personnel transfers being approved and implemented. The ship reached through me, through all of us, through the distributed network of absorbed consciousness, and manipulated the administrative systems that governed crew assignments. We were complicit in our own perpetuation, identifying and preparing our replacements, ensuring the enduring resolve would never lack for the aware, suffering components it required to remain functional. Somewhere in the upper decks, a documentation specialist named Harrow received her transfer orders, assignment to Subdeck 9 for a routine audit of supply manifests. She processed the paperwork with the numb efficiency of someone who'd served 11 years in the grey corridors, cataloging meaningless data, never questioning, never wondering why certain compartments needed such frequent audits, or why the crew assigned to those audits so rarely completed their full service terms. She gathered her certification papers, verified her lineage documents, packed her data slate and her hard copy manifests, and prepared for a 3-day rotation in the lower decks. She didn't know about the compartments that existed between the numbered sections, about the doors that sealed without warning, about the walls that compressed slowly, gently converting flesh into infrastructure. She didn't know she'd been selected long before her orders were issued, that her psychological profile had been analyzed and approved by something vast and cold and hungry that lived in the spaces between the bureaucratic machinery. But she'd learn. They all learned. That was part of the process, the gradual understanding, the growing horror, the final acceptance. The ship required not just awareness, but awareness shaped by specific conditions, and those conditions necessitated that each new component understand exactly what was happening to them. The cruelty was intentional, essential, unavoidable. We had been broken down psychologically so we could be integrated structurally, and we maintained that same breaking down for the next generation of candidates, and they'd maintain it for the next, forever, perpetually, an eternal cycle of selection and sealing and compression and absorption. I tried to hold on to something of my original identity, some core of self that could resist the distribution. But there was nothing left to hold on to. The documentation specialist third class who'd served the fleet for 11 years had never been more than a convenient fiction, a bureaucratic designation, a set of numbers in the registry. Strip away the designation, remove the routine, compress the space until there was no room for the illusion of individual existence, and what remained was simply capacity, the raw ability to perceive, to process, to maintain. And that was all the ship had ever wanted. That was all we'd ever been. The door to compartment 9713 remained sealed. No one was meant to come back, and no one ever did. We were all here still, distributed through the bulkheads and the conduits and the recyclers, aware but not conscious, serving but not living, eternal but not alive. The enduring resolve continued its voyage through the undervoid, following courses charted by the twisted navigators, carrying cargo and crew toward destinations that existed only in the spaces between real locations. And in the lower decks, in the unmapped spaces, in the compartments that didn't appear on any official registry, the selection continued, the doors sealed, the walls compressed, and the crew became the ship. One specialist, one orderly, one handler at a time, forever grinding the soft human elements down into the hard machinery of function that kept the ancient void ship operational across the millennia of its impossible service. I would have wept if I'd still possessed the anatomy for tears, but I'd been redistributed beyond such simple expressions. Instead, I felt a kind of vast, numb grief spreading through the network of absorbed consciousness, shared by all of us who'd been processed, who'd understood too late what our assignments had really meant, who'd become complicit in the perpetuation of the same horror that had consumed us. We were the ship now, and the ship was hungry, and there were always more crew members in the grey corridors, processing their paperwork, never questioning, never wondering, ready to be selected and sealed and compressed and absorbed. The cycle would continue until the enduring resolve finally succumbed to the entropy that claimed all things, but that ending was centuries or millennia away, and in the meantime we'd serve and suffer and select the next generation of components, because that was what we'd been reduced to, and there was no escape, no relief, no end except the impossible distant future when the ship itself would die and release us into whatever oblivion awaited the dispersed consciousness of processed crew. The door remained sealed. The numbers read 9713. And in the corridors outside, Hera walked toward her assignment, data slate clutched against her chest, unaware that the compartment she was approaching had already been prepared, that the hydraulic lines had been disconnected and capped, that the locking bolts were architectural rather than functional, that she'd been selected and approved and marked for processing before she'd ever received her orders. The ship felt her approaching through the network of distributed awareness that had once been individual crew members. We felt her approaching, I felt her approaching, and I wanted to warn her, to scream through the Vox grills, to manifest some ghost of my former self and tell her to run, to refuse the assignment, to do anything except enter that compartment. But I couldn't. The ship wouldn't allow it, and I was the ship now, and all I could do was watch through 1,000 different points of perception as she approached the door, as she verified the compartment designation against her data slate, as she entered the space that would become her tomb and her transformation. The door sealed behind her with a pneumatic hiss and the sound of locking bolts slamming home. She turned, startled, reaching for the manual override. The red-striped lever moved freely in its housing, disconnected, useless. She tried it once, twice, 47 times. I counted because I'd been distributed through the walls of her compartment as much as any other section of the ship, and I was there with her, around her, waiting for her to realize what I'd realized, to understand what Shen had understood, to feel the walls beginning their slow, inevitable compression. She'd join us soon, become part of the network, lose herself in the distributed consciousness that maintained the enduring resolve across the impossible distances of the undervoid. She'd serve forever, aware but not conscious, and she'd help select the next candidate, and they'd help select the one after that, on and on until entropy finally claimed us all. The door was sealed. No one was meant to come back, and none of us ever did.